Thank you. So perhaps what I'm going to say today is controversial. This is where logic and analysis takes me. The foundation of what I want to talk about today is an assumption, an argument that to date, attempts by the international community to induce change in North Korea have largely been miserable failures. And so I want to briefly introduce four approaches that are mostly new. They've not been a part of mainstream discourse about either unification or change in North Korea. Each approach carries considerable risks, but the alternative is the status quo, and it's my belief that the status quo does not achieve unification. So I was asked to come here and to consider how the international community could intervene in North Korea to produce or to promote change. Of course, the thing that's most surprising about North Korea is actually its remarkable continuity over time, right? It's the absence of change that is puzzling when we look at North Korea. So what do I mean? The discourse of Sungun, military first, is still pervasive. North Korea's military is still operating on Soviet-era equipment for the most part, from the 1950s, 60s, 1970s. The North Korean people, especially in the Shigol, the rural areas outside of Pyongyang, are still mostly starving. The improvement of the lives of individual North Koreans happens mostly within Pyongyang. North Korea's nuclear program, despite all threats, inducements, and promises, continues to develop. And most importantly, North Korea's political system continues to be effectively single-family rule as opposed to totalitarian state. So this is remarkable continuity as the world is evolving around it, right? Now, when we think about change in North Korea, of course, we wish for peaceful change. That's the right vision, that's the right goal. But I think that as a political scientist, as a strategist, we cannot succumb, I cannot succumb to sort of wishful thinking about what kind of outcomes are possible or likely in North Korea. And I think that peaceful outcomes will be as dependent on North Korean decision-making and on North Korean political processes as they will South Korean decision-making and South Korean political processes. I believe if we take a strategic approach to analyzing the challenge that change in North Korea represents, we'll find that there are peaceful outcomes that are possible and there are tragic, violent outcomes that are possible as part of a process of change. So the question for me, for us, is how do we get to the peaceful outcomes? How do we avoid the violent, tragic outcomes? And what role can the international community play to get us where we want to go? So with the aim of clarifying our collective thinking about how the international community can influence change in North Korea, I'd like to draw your attention to four approaches that I'll quickly sketch out. And again, these are somewhat controversial. I imagine it'll stimulate discussion. The first is military diplomacy, military engagement with North Korea. The second, I would describe it as technical or technological subversion. The third is a counter-legitimacy approach. And the fourth is a humanitarian intervention approach. And so these approaches to promoting change in North Korea are not mutually exclusive necessarily, but they do operate according to different principles of logic. Each represents a distinct theory for how to promote positive change in North Korea through international efforts, but each also has considerable risks. It's not obvious that any of these approaches will actually succeed, and there could be great tragic downside consequences. So in the list of my four approaches, you'll notice there's two things that I did not mention that actually would have been obvious, which is the approaches used today. On the one hand, global isolation, containment, and on the other, sort of social or humanitarian engagement through NGOs and sort of social missions engaging North Korea. North Korea's surprising resilience to outside efforts for change lead me to conclude that these two dominant approaches are effective for making us feel better. We feel like we're doing something, and they're not necessarily producing bad outcomes, but they're not working. They're premised on unrealistic theories of change, which is why to date they have failed to produce the change that we seek in North Korea. Hostile pressure from outside, coercion, rarely changes the strategic intentions of a target. So international pressure on North Korea is important for reasons of symbolism, but we cannot mistake that for having strategic effect. It's unlikely that international pressure by itself will simply change North Korea's longer-term intentions. A social or humanitarian engagement with North Korea has similarly proven fruitless in a strategic sense. One reason for this is that there is no real civil society in North Korea, right? And so there's very little that can be changed by engaging North Korea at the grassroots until there is a semblance of like a civil society. The other reason is that, very simply, the regime in Pyongyang uses civilian and NGO engagement with North Korea to build its own narratives. It uses these engagements to its own advantage as sort of pro-Pyongyang propaganda. So North Korea allows these types of engagements, and then it tries as best as it can to use it to reinforce a narrative that supports regime control. So given this, perhaps one or more new approaches are necessary. The first new approach that I think at least merits consideration is military engagement with the Korean People's Army, the KPA. So I'm not just talking about South Korean engagement militarily, which is difficult, or US military engagement, which is also difficult, but engagement, Western militaries everywhere engaging with the KPA. To many, the KPA may represent the very embodiment of the enemy. But I believe that there are multiple benefits that are possible through a sort of military-to-military engagement that has almost no cost and small comparative risks. A good case study is the revolution in Egypt. So during the early days of the revolution, there was a military coup that overthrew President Mubarak in Egypt. And in those early days, it was US military connections to the Egyptian military that proved vital for maintaining awareness about what was happening inside Egypt in real time, and for indirectly influencing Egyptian military decisions to help maintain order. That influence waned pretty quickly, it seems like, but in those early days, that connectivity was invaluable. And so this case of Egypt shows the latent value of military-to-military relationships. For a very small investment up front, there's a very high payoff potential in terms of intelligence and security. And so if a similar situation occurred inside North Korea, the only linkages with the KPA today are the Chinese People's Liberation Army. So political or social instability in North Korea would, in all likelihood, give the Chinese disproportionate influence relative to South Korea, relative to the international community. And so we have to ask ourselves if we really want that. The second approach that I want to talk about briefly is, I call it like a technical subversive approach. And it relies on technology to engage with North Korean citizens and elites subversively. So the underlying principle is the same principle that motivates South Korean NGOs to send balloons into North Korea. The difference is that this approach would leverage technology to a greater degree. So in Egypt, the revolution was possible because of a social media platform called Ushahidi. This platform, the Egyptian security services, the Egyptian government, monitored the activity on it, but the citizens that participated on this platform were able to slowly develop coded languages, hidden business rules, and this allowed them to engage in subversive conversations. And we think of Twitter as being the face of the Egyptian revolution, or the essential tool. Twitter was essential for coordinating the Egyptian revolution once it started, but Ushahidi was the platform that made collective action possible. And so this kind of platform doesn't exist in North Korea today, but given the effect that it had in Egypt, we should at least be asking the question, do we want this kind of thing in North Korea? If so, how? A third approach that is very controversial, I call it like a counter-legitimacy approach, and it is fomenting change inside North Korea through counter-legitimacy, organizational, political moves, and through narrative. And so under this approach, the international community could mobilize to provide legitimacy to a North Korean government in exile that would serve as the official North Korean government as the world turns away from the remaining government in Pyongyang. This would be a dramatic policy change, requiring the replacement of current North Korean embassies with new government in exile representatives. This would create heated debates at the United Nations. The risk, obviously, is that China and Russia would refuse to cooperate, which would lead to global contestation about which North Korea is the legitimate Korea. The second risk, of course, is that North Korea will simply resort to violence in order to assert its own legitimacy. So it would be difficult to prevent war in this kind of approach. The final humanitarian intervention approach is premised on the idea that the international community no longer believes North Korea is capable of governing itself. So under the responsibility to protect norm, the international community could decide to impose naval quarantines and no-fly zones around North Korea, possibly create safe havens within areas of North Korea to protect internally displaced persons. The problem, of course, is that the North Korean government would not stand by and simply let this happen. In all likelihood, North Korea would respond violently. Would China support a UN declaration for a responsibility to protect in North Korea? Probably not. So in some ways, the humanitarian intervention approach represents the most morally correct approach to North Korea, but paradoxically, it's also the approach most likely to produce war. So where does this leave us? The dominant status quo approaches, containment and isolation or social engagement, have been abysmal failures. Yet the four alternatives that I've identified here very briefly pose new types of risks that I don't know if we're ready to handle. And so which risks then are most acceptable to South Korea and to the alliance? As time passes, it seems to me that the status quo in North Korea is becoming less acceptable to many in South Korea, but the alternatives that I've identified here have a whole different set of risks to consider. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.